The bus rumbled across the cracked asphalt, its faded green paint chipped by years of hauling recruits into the unknown. Inside, a dozen young men sat in tense silence, their heads shaved close, eyes forward. The air smelled faintly of sweat and nerves. Elena Ramirez sat near the back, her small frame barely filling the wide seat. Her duffel bag rested on her knees, pressed tight to her chest like armor. She felt the bus slow, the weight of anticipation pressing on her ribs harder than any seatbelt. Through the smudged window, she caught her first glimpse at Marine Corps' recruit depot, Paris Island. Rows of low, gray buildings stood under the merciless South Carolina sun, flanked by training fields that stretched into the distance. The gates loomed like the threshold to another world. The men around her sat taller, some puffing out their chests as though preparing to prove themselves the moment the doors opened. Elena noticed how broad their shoulders were, how their arms bulged. Even in rest, she was the only woman on the bus, and easily the smallest body in sight. Her pulse quickened, but her face remained calm. She had learned long ago that showing fear was an invitation for it to grow. The bus hissed as it pulled to a stop. A drill instructor in a campaign hat stormed up the steps, his voice a whip across the silence. "Get off my bus. Now. Move. Move, move." The recruits scrambled, stumbling over themselves in the rush to obey. Elena gripped her bag tighter and slid into the aisle. A tall, muscular man behind her snorted. "Careful, little one," he muttered. "Wouldn't want you getting trampled." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Outside, the heat hit her like a wall, thick and suffocating. The recruits lined up on the yellow footprints painted across the pavement, each set spaced precisely. Apart, Elena found her pair near the edge and planted her boots firmly, squaring her shoulders. The drill instructor's voice cut through the humid air. "You are no longer civilians. You are nothing until you earn the title of United States Marine." His eyes swept the line like searchlights, pausing when they landed on Elena. His jaw twitched. He didn't say anything, but the flicker of doubt was obvious. She had seen that look before, from teachers, from coaches, from strangers in the grocery store, who thought they could sum her up at a glance. Too small, too soft, weak. The recruits were herded toward the barracks, the sound of boots thundering against concrete. Elena kept pace, her breathing steady. Inside, the building smelled of bleach and metal, every surface polished to a shine that reflected fluorescent lights. Beds stood in perfect rows, sheets tucked with surgical precision. "Drop your bags. Line up at the foot of your racks," the instructor barked. Elena obeyed, setting her duffel down neatly. As the recruits shuffled into place, whispered comments drifted through the line. "Man, she's tiny. She won't last. Bet. She cries before the week's over." The words slid past her like rain off steel. She kept her gaze forward, spine straight, chin up. The drill instructor stalked down the line, his boots clicking against the floor. He stopped in front of a tall, broad-shouldered recruit and exploded into a tirade about posture. Then another, berating him for the faint trace of a smirk. Finally, he reached Elena. His shadow fell over her. He looked her up and down slowly, like he was trying to decide if she was a joke or a challenge. "What's your name, recruit?" "Ramirez, sir." Her voice rang loud, crisp, unshaken. The instructor's lip curled, almost into a smile. "Almost. You think you belong here, Ramirez?" "Yes, sir." He leaned closer until she could see the creases in his weathered skin, could feel the heat of his breath. "We'll see about that." He moved on, leaving her heart hammering, but her expression unchanged. She had passed the first test, not showing weakness under scrutiny. That night, as the lights clicked off and the barracks fell into silence, Elena lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. The bed felt stiff, the air heavy with the scent of detergent and nerves. She could hear the steady breathing of the recruits around her, some already snoring, others whispering in low voices about home or girlfriends. She turned her head to the side and caught sight of the recruit across from her, a burly man with tattoos crawling up his arms. He was watching her with a smirk. "Hey, Ramirez," he whispered. "You lost? This isn't summer camp." His friends chuckled quietly. Elena didn't respond. She rolled onto her back again, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Words were cheap, proving them wrong would be priceless. She thought of her mother's worried face when she'd first announced her decision to enlist. "Mia, it's too dangerous. You'll get hurt." She had hugged Elena tightly, her voice trembling. "You don't have to do this." But Elena did. She hadn't come here to be safe. She had come here to forge herself into something unbreakable. Sleep finally claimed her, but it was restless, filled with images of running until her legs gave. Out of hands pulling her down, of voices telling her she wasn't enough. When the lights blazed on at dawn and the drill instructor's shouts thundered through the room, she rose with the rest, her resolve unshaken. The next morning, training began in earnest. The recruits were driven onto the parade deck, lined up with mechanical precision. The sun had barely risen, but already sweat trickled down their necks. "Drop and give me 20, the instructor barked. Elena dropped to the pavement with the others, palms burning as they pressed against the hot surface. She pushed herself up and down, her arms trembling under the strain. By the 10th push-up, her muscles screamed. By the 15th, her arms felt like rubber. She stole a glance to her side. The big recruit with tattoos pounded out the reps effortlessly, a grin plastered across his face. By the time she reached 20, her arms quivered violently, and she barely managed to lock them out. The instructor's voice cut into her ears like a blade. "Pathetic, Ramirez. Weak arms won't carry a rifle." A ripple of laughter swept through the line. Elena forced herself to her feet, eyes forward. She refused to let them see her break. The day only grew harder. Sprints across the training field left her gasping, her chest on fire. Weapon drills made her arms ache until she thought they might fall off. Obstacle courses turned her small, frame into a disadvantage, her hands slipping on ropes and her legs barely reaching platforms that others scaled easily. Each failure was met with groans, laughter, and muttered comments. The 5 recruits who had mocked her the night before were the loudest, their voices following her like gnats. "Featherweight. Should have stayed home. She won't last a week." Elena ground her teeth, refusing to respond. She saved her energy for pushing forward, for one more pull-up, one more sprint, one more obstacle. Every insult became fuel, every laugh a spark in her chest. When the day finally ended and the recruits stumbled back to the barracks, Elena's body ached from head to toe. She collapsed onto her bunk, drenched in sweat, every muscle screaming. The others sprawled out around her, groaning, laughing, complaining. But Elena didn't join in. She stared at the ceiling again, her breath slowing, her mind already preparing for tomorrow. She knew this was only the beginning, and she knew sooner or later the moment would come when she would have to prove herself, not just to the instructors, not just to the recruits, but to herself. Until then, she would endure, because weakness wasn't what they thought it was. Weakness was giving up, and that, Elena Ramirez would never do. The first week of training was designed to break even the strongest recruits. Sleep was rationed, meals were rushed, and every waking second was consumed by drills that pushed bodies beyond their limits. For Elena Ramirez, the days blurred into a relentless cycle of pain and humiliation. The sun had barely risen on her 3rd day when the recruits were marched to the running track. Their instructor, a wiry man with eyes like flint, barked orders with a voice that seemed carved from stone. 3 miles. You will finish together, or you will finish broken. Move! The recruits surged forward, boots thudding in unison. Elena fell into stride at the back, her breaths shallow and quick. The pack pulled away almost instantly, their long legs devouring the distance. She fought to keep up, each stride a battle. By the first mile, sweat poured down her face, stinging. Her eyes, her lungs burned, her chest tightening with each breath. She clenched her fists, pumping her arms harder, but the gap widened. Voices drifted back from the front. She's falling behind again. Told you she wouldn't last. Her jaw tightened, but her legs betrayed her, growing heavier with every step. She forced herself onward, refusing to stop. By the time the group finished, Elena staggered across the line several paces behind, her body trembling. The instructor's glare cut into her. Ramirez, do you think the enemy will wait for you to catch up? No, sir. Her voice cracked, hoarse from the effort. Then why are you running like you've already lost the fight? She bit her tongue, holding back the sharp reply that rose in her throat. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't weak, that she was trying harder than anyone out there. But in the Marines, excuses were weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. Drop and give me 30. Her arms screamed as she lowered herself to the ground. The pavement seared her palms as she pumped through the push-ups, her elbows shaking. Uncontrollably by the 20th, she finished, collapsing onto her knees, chest heaving. The instructor barely looked at her before turning to the others. That night, the barracks buzzed with low voices. Recruits compared blistered feet, sore shoulders, and the endless shouting of the instructors. Elena sat quietly on her bunk, massaging her aching calves. The group of 5 men who had taunted her since arrival sat a few racks away, their laughter carrying through the room. Did you see her back there? Looked like she was running through quicksand, one said, grinning. She can't even keep up with warm-ups, another added. How's she supposed to survive combat? The biggest of the group, a man named Dalton, leaned back on his bunk, arms crossed. She's a liability. If she were in my squad, I'd leave her behind. The others chuckled, nodding. Elena kept her eyes on her boots, her face expressionless. Inside, though, the words burrowed deep. A liability. Dead weight, not cut out for this. She had heard those words before at school, on the soccer field, even from her own relatives. And each time, she had answered them by working harder, proving herself. But here, in this place built to strip recruits bare, the doubts felt heavier. The next day was weapons training. The recruits lined up, rifles in hand, while instructors barked commands. Elena gripped her weapon tightly, her hands slick with sweat. Ramirez, eyes up. Focus. Yes, sir. Her stance wobbled as the weapon's weight dragged at her arms. By the end of the drill, her shoulders burned, her fingers numb. When she lowered the rifle, it nearly slipped from her grip. The instructor's eyes narrowed. You drop that weapon, Ramirez, and you're done. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. She shouted, forcing her arms to lock steady, though her muscles screamed in protest. From the corner of her eye, she saw Dalton watching her with a smirk. He mouthed a single word, weak. Her stomach twisted, but she forced her face blank. Later that afternoon came the obstacle course. The recruits charged through mud, climbed ropes, and vaulted walls under the unrelenting sun. Elena attacked the course with determination, but each obstacle seemed designed to mock her. She slipped halfway up the rope, her arms trembling, and slid back into the mud. Come on, Ramirez. An instructor bellowed. You think the enemy's going to give you a ladder? Gritting her teeth, she jumped again, scraping her palms raw as she clawed for the top. She reached it finally, gasping, only to face the next challenge. a wall taller than she was. The others vaulted over with ease, their long legs giving them momentum. Elena sprinted forward, leaped, and slammed against the wall, sliding back down. The 5 Marines laughed openly. Need a step stool? One jeered. Elena ignored them, sprinting again, throwing every ounce of energy into the jump. This time, her fingers caught the edge. With a guttural sound, she hauled herself up, legs, kicking, until she swung over and dropped to the other side. Her arms throbbed, her knees ached, but she kept running. Every obstacle that knocked her down, she faced again, no matter how many times it bruised her or scraped her raw. By the time she crossed the finish, mud-streaked and panting, she was dead last. The instructor shook his head. Ramirez, you are dragging this unit down. Yes, sir, she rasped, unable to catch her breath. The other recruits looked at her with a mix of pity and disdain. In their eyes, she wasn't a fighter, she was a burden. That night, Elena lay awake long. After lights out, the barracks was quiet except for the soft snoring of exhausted recruits. She stared into the darkness, her mind replaying every stumble, every laugh, every whispered word. Maybe they're right, a voice whispered inside her. Maybe you don't belong here. Maybe you're not strong enough. Her chest tightened, the weight of doubt pressing down harder than any obstacle. She rolled onto her side, clutching her blanket, her throat burning. For the first time since arriving, tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. But then another memory surfaced. Her father's voice, calm and steady. Strength isn't always about winning, Elena. It's about refusing to quit when losing seems easier. She drew a shaky breath, blinking away the tears. She hadn't come here to be the fastest or the strongest. She had come here to become unbreakable. And unbreakable meant enduring, no matter how much it hurt. The next morning, her body felt like lead, but she rose with the others. During PT, she fell behind again. During weapons drills, her arms quivered. During the obstacle course, she scraped her knees bloody. But she never stopped. And though the instructors' voices cut into her, and the recruits' whispers followed her, a small spark burned inside her chest. It was faint, almost fragile, but it was there. She wasn't proving anything yet. She wasn't respected, not even close, but she was still standing. And that, she reminded herself, was enough for now, because weakness wasn't failing. Weakness was giving up. And no matter how many doubts they hurled at her, Elena Ramirez wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. Not ever. The days blurred together into an endless cycle of sweat, pain, and commands barked at ear-splitting volume. Every morning began with the shrill whistle, and the drill instructors storming through the barracks, ripping recruits from their bunks. Before dawn. By the time the sun broke the horizon, they were already running, already aching. For Elena Ramirez, the days weren't just physically punishing, they were emotionally brutal. Each stumble, each delayed push-up, each slow lap became fodder for the whispers and laughter that followed her like a shadow. It started small, a snicker when she fell behind on a run, a mocking clap when she slipped during drills. But soon, 5 men made it their personal mission to turn her struggle into a performance for the others. They were an intimidating group big, broad-shouldered, already moving with the confidence of men who believed they had nothing to prove. Dalton, the tattooed giant, was their unspoken leader. His voice was always the loudest, his laughter the cruelest. One evening, after a grueling day on the obstacle course, the recruits gathered in the barracks to clean gear and prepare for inspection. Elena sat cross-legged on her bunk, polishing her boots until they gleamed. Her arms ached, her palms were blistered, but she worked with quiet focus. Dalton strolled past her bunk, his boots echoing on the polished floor. He slowed, glancing down at her. You missed a spot, he said, pointing to her boot. Elena looked up, her face calm. No, I didn't, Dalton smirked. You sure? Or maybe you just can't see straight after all that running. His friends chuckled from across the room. One of them, a lanky recruit with a crooked nose, leaned over. Careful, Dalton. If she stares too hard, she might cry. The laughter spread, bouncing off the barracks walls. Elena's hands tightened around the cloth, but she kept her eyes on her boots. Dalton crouched, so his face was level with hers. His smirk never wavered. Tell me something, Ramirez. Do you honestly think you'll make it through this? Because from where I'm standing, you're slowing the rest of us down. Elena met his eyes. I'll make it. Her voice was quiet, but steady. Dalton chuckled, shaking his head. We'll see about that. He stood, walking back to his bunk. His friends continued laughing, whispering to each other, but Elena blocked them out, her hands moving steadily over the boots until they gleamed brighter than glass. The next day, the recruits were ordered into hand-to-hand combat drills. Paired. Off in the training pit, they practiced strikes, blocks, and takedowns under the watchful eyes of instructors. When Elena's turn came, she was paired against Dalton. The smirk spread across his face the moment her name was called. Oh, this is going to be fun, he muttered. They squared off. Dalton towered over her, his arms like tree trunks compared to her slender frame. Begin, the instructor barked. Dalton lunged. Elena sidestepped, her body moving instinctively, but his size and speed overwhelmed her. He swept her legs, sending her sprawling into the dirt. Pathetic. Dalton laughed, offering her no hand up. The instructor's glare silenced the laughter. Again, Elena climbed to her feet, wiping dirt from her face. Her chest rose and fell, but her eyes never left Dalton. They clashed again. Dalton shoved her back easily, knocking the wind from her lungs. She stumbled, but this time didn't fall. She dug in, regaining her stance. Better, the instructor said, though his tone held little conviction. Dalton leaned close enough for her to hear his whisper. You don't belong here. Elena ignored him. She focused on her breathing, her footwork, remembering what she'd practiced alone in the dark barracks when no one was watching. Dalton's strength was overwhelming, but strength wasn't everything. Not yet. By the end of the drill, she was bruised and sore, but still standing. Dalton strutted away, as though he had won some grand battle. His friends clapped him on the back, grinning, but Elena didn't see defeat in her bruises. She saw lessons. Every fall, every shove, every taunt, they were teaching her more than Dalton realized. Later that week, the mockery escalated. During chow time, Elena sat at the end of a long table, quietly eating her rations. Dalton and his crew slid into the seats across from her. Dalton took one look at her tray and smirked. You sure you don't want 2 portions? Might actually put some muscle on those arms. The crook-nosed recruit laughed, pointing at her spoon. Careful, man. If she eats too much, she might not make it through the run tomorrow. The others chuckled, their voices carrying through the crowded hall. A few nearby recruits joined in, shaking their heads, amused at her expense. Elena set her spoon down. Slowly, her face unreadable. She finished her meal in silence, then stood and walked away without a word. Dalton called after her. Don't worry, Ramirez. We'll carry you if you fall behind again. The hall erupted in laughter. Elena didn't turn around. That night, lying in her bunk, Elena stared at the ceiling as the echoes of laughter replayed in her head. For the first time, anger began to bubble beneath her calm exterior. Not just at Dalton or the others, but at the way everyone seemed to accept their mockery as truth. They think I'm weak. They think I'll break. They think I don't belong. her fists clenched under the blanket. She had never hated anyone before. Not really, but Dalton and his gang stirred something deep inside her. Not hatred, exactly, but a fire, a defiance that demanded she prove them wrong. She remembered her father's words again, the same ones she had clung to during the darkest nights. The smallest crack can break the strongest stone if struck the right way. Dalton was a wall, tall and strong, but walls could fall. And she was learning where to strike. The next day brought another test, endurance drills. The recruits ran laps carrying heavy packs, sweat soaking their uniforms. Elena's body screamed in protest, but she kept running, her eyes fixed on Dalton's broad back ahead of her. Every time she stumbled, every time her legs threatened to quit, she forced herself forward. When she crossed the line behind the others, Dalton turned, grinning. "Look at that." She finished, barely. His friends laughed, but this time Elena smiled faintly to herself. Barely was still finishing. And finishing meant she was still here. The mockery didn't stop, but something inside her shifted. Their laughter no longer felt like chains around her neck. It felt like fuel for the fire burning in her chest. They wanted her to break. Instead, she would bend until she became steel. The days wore on, each one harder than the last. The 5 Marines kept up their taunts, louder now, bolder, as though daring her to quit. They imitated her stumbling gait after long runs, mimicked her strained push-ups, laughed at the mud caked on her uniform after every obstacle course. But Elena gave them nothing, no reaction, no crack in her calm. At night, when the barracks went dark, she trained in silence footwork, strikes, balance. Every bruise from Dalton became a reminder of what to adjust. Every insult became a reason to rise earlier, to push harder. The mockery had become a weapon, but Elena was learning to turn it against them. She wasn't ready yet, but she was getting closer, closer to the day when the laughter would stop. The barracks had a rhythm, a breathing pattern that Elena quickly learned. By day, it was chaos. Boots pounding on asphalt, instructors screaming, recruits groaning through push-ups, pull-ups, sprints. By night, it fell into silence, broken only by the snores of exhausted men and the occasional shift of a bunk. For most recruits, the lights-out siren meant blessed relief. It meant sinking into thin mattresses, muscles aching but thankful for rest. For Elena, it meant the beginning of something different. When the others slept, she trained. The first time, she slipped quietly from her bunk, careful not to wake the men around her. She padded softly across the barracks floor, boots tied loose to muffle her steps. Outside, the night air was cool, heavy with the scent of pine and salt carried from the marshlands. The moon hung low, silver light spilling across the training yard. Elena dropped her duffel bag onto the dirt and knelt, pulling out a notebook. It was worn and creased, the corners frayed from years of use. On its pages were scribbled notes, diagrams, and reminders, everything she had studied before coming here. Martial arts drills from a community dojo back home, quotes from books on military history, lessons her father had drilled into her. Leverage is stronger than force. Precision outlasts power. Calm defeats chaos. She opened the notebook, scanned the sketches of body positions and pressure points, and began to move. At first, her body protested. Her arms trembled as she practiced blocks and strikes. Her legs wobbled as she rehearsed footwork. But she pushed through, repeating each movement again and again, until it felt less like clumsy mimicry and more like memory returning to her bones. She worked in silence, the sound of her breath the only rhythm. She imagined Dalton charging at her, the others circling, mocking. She visualized their movements, their size, their weight, and imagined herself flowing around them, not resisting, but redirecting. The smallest crack can break the strongest stone if struck the right way. Her father's words echoed with every motion. Night after night, she repeated the ritual. After punishing days of drills, she forced her body back into motion long after. The others had collapsed. She studied the way leverage could topple a man twice her size, how shifting weight at the right moment could turn brute strength into liability. When her arms burned, she practiced breathing. When her legs shook, she drilled balance. When her body begged for sleep, she pictured Dalton's smirk and kept moving. By the end of the first week, the bruises on her arms were matched by new calluses on her palms. By the second, her movements had grown sharper, faster, more precise. She began to feel something unfamiliar, control. The next time she sparred in training, she didn't win, not yet. Dalton still tossed her to the ground with brute force, but she lasted longer. Her stance was steadier, and for the first time, the instructor raised an eyebrow. One night, as she practiced outside, she heard footsteps crunching on gravel. She froze, notebook half hidden under her boot. A voice spoke softly. "You're going to burn yourself out." Elena turned. It was one of the quieter recruits, a thin man named Cooper. Unlike Dalton's group, Cooper kept to himself, his voice rarely heard over the noise of the barracks. "I'm fine," Elena said. Cooper studied her, his face unreadable in the moonlight. "Why do you do this to yourself? They're never going to stop mocking you." Elena's jaw tightened. "Then I'll give them a reason to." Cooper didn't laugh. He didn't mock. He just nodded once, then walked back into the shadows, leaving Elena alone with her determination. The days continued their brutal pace. Elena still fell behind on runs, still trembled during weapons drills, still scraped her knees raw on obstacle courses. The mockery didn't stop. If anything, it grew sharper, Dalton's voice carrying over the training fields like a whip. But Elena no longer let it pierce her. She had discovered a strange kind of peace in the punishment. Every failure was fuel for the night. Every stumble was a lesson. Every insult was a challenge whispered into her ear. Work harder. Prove them wrong. At night, when others slept, she became a ghost drilling, studying, perfecting. Her body grew stronger, yes, but more importantly, her mind sharpened. She was learning patience. She was learning control. And she was learning silence. The others fought their battles loudly, with bravado, with laughter, with arrogance. Elena fought hers alone, quietly, in the dark. One evening, Dalton and his crew cornered her outside the mess hall. "You think practicing in secret makes you stronger?" Dalton sneered, his breath heavy with the scent of chow. "I've seen you running around at night like some kind of ninja. It won't save you." The others laughed. Elena met Dalton's eyes calmly. "Maybe not," she said softly, "but it'll save me from being like you." The laughter stopped. If only for a heartbeat. Dalton's jaw flexed, anger flashing in his eyes. But before he could respond, the drill instructor barked for them to line up, breaking the tension. As the recruits marched off, Dalton shot her a glare that promised retribution. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't need to. The weeks dragged on, punishing as ever. But while the others grew weary, Elena grew sharper. Her movements became efficient, economical. She conserved her energy, focused her strikes, honed her timing. She began to notice things others missed, the slight shift of an instructor's stance before he barked an order, the twitch of Dalton's muscles before he lunged, the way laughter always covered fear. The silence of her resolve was teaching her more than brute force ever could. By the time the recruits entered their second month, Elena wasn't just surviving anymore. She was preparing. Late one night, after another endless day of drills, Elena stood alone in the yard, sweat dripping from her chin as she moved through her practiced forms. Her body felt carved from stone, her mind razor sharp. She imagined Dalton again, charging. At her, she sidestepped, twisted, struck. She pictured the others surrounding her. She swept, deflected, dropped them one by one. For a moment, she could almost see it, the day when training would no longer be theory. The day when silence would give way to action. She lowered her arms, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The night was still, the barracks quiet behind her. Elena Ramirez smiled faintly to herself. They thought silence was weakness. They didn't understand that silence was sharpening the blade. And one day soon, that blade would cut through everything in her way. The morning began like any other, but there was something sharp in the air, an unspoken tension threading through the ranks. The recruits lined up on the training field, sweat already forming under the rising sun. The instructors barked orders, their voices carrying across the yard like thunder, but today, even their shouts seemed to crackle with anticipation. It was combat training day. Hand-to-hand drills were the part of training everyone dreaded and secretly looked forward to. It was the one time recruits could settle grudges without words, under the thin veil of practice. For Elena Ramirez, it was another chance to endure. For Dalton and his crew, it was something else entirely. The recruits gathered in a wide circle, the ground scuffed with footprints from earlier bouts. Pairs were called out one at a time, taking turns grappling under the watchful eyes of instructors. Some matches ended in quick takedowns, others dragged into drawn-out struggles, but each one was cheered or jeered by the crowd. Elena stood quietly at the edge, her heart pounding. She knew what was coming. She could feel it in the way Dalton's crew whispered among themselves, their grins too wide, their eyes darting toward her with anticipation. Finally, her name was called. Ramirez. She stepped forward, boots crunching against the dirt. Her chest rose and fell steadily, though her pulse thundered in her ears. Across the circle, Dalton stepped out, rolling his shoulders, smirk already etched on his face. The crowd of recruits erupted in murmurs, some chuckling, some whistling. "Oh, this is gonna be good," someone muttered. Dalton's voice carried over the circle. "Finally. Thought I'd never get my turn with you." The instructor's eyes narrowed. "This is training, Dalton. You will respect the drill?" "Yes, sir," Dalton said smoothly, though his smirk never faltered. He turned back to Elena, lowering his voice just enough for only her to hear. "Try not to embarrass yourself too badly." Elena didn't answer. She slid into her stance, knees bent, arms raised, eyes locked on him. "Begin." Dalton lunged immediately, his sheer size overwhelming. Elena sidestepped, just as she had practiced, but he was fast for his bulk. His arm hooked around her waist, hauling her off her feet, and he slammed her into the dirt with a thud that rattled her bones. The crowd roared with laughter. "Too easy," someone shouted. Dalton loomed over her, grinning. "You should have stayed home, Ramirez." Elena rolled to her feet, wiping dirt from her cheek. Her chest burned, but her eyes remained steady. She slipped back into stance. They clashed again. Dalton's fists swung heavy, wide arcs meant to overwhelm. Elena ducked one, but the second grazed her shoulder, spinning her off balance. He shoved her hard, and she stumbled backward, barely regaining her footing. The laughter grew louder. "Come on, Ramirez. Fight back." Elena's teeth clenched. She could feel the old doubt whispering inside her. "They're right. You're too small, too weak. You don't belong here." But underneath the doubt, something else stirred anger, sharp and steady. She focused on her breathing, on the rhythm she had drilled night after night in silence. Dalton was bigger, stronger, faster. But he was also reckless, his size making him arrogant. He lunged too hard, swung too wide, left himself open in his eagerness to humiliate her. She could use that. Again, the instructor barked. They squared off. Dalton sneered, circling her. I'll make this quick. Elena didn't respond. She breathed slow, calm, her eyes tracking his movements. Dalton charged. This time, instead of retreating, Elena pivoted. She stepped inside his swing, just enough to deflect it, and drove her elbow into his ribs. The impact wasn't hard enough to drop him, but it staggered him, surprise flashing in his eyes. The crowd gasped. Dalton recovered quickly, snarling, and lunged again. He wrapped his arms around her, lifting her off the ground, and drove her back into the dirt. Pain exploded across her spine. The laughter returned, but quieter this time, edged with uncertainty. Dalton leaned close, his breath hot against her. Ear, nice try, but you're still nothing. Elena's vision blurred for a moment, the pain radiating through her body. But deep inside, her resolve flared brighter. She had landed a strike. A small one, yes, but enough to remind her he wasn't invincible. She wasn't finished. The instructor called an end to the match before it spiraled further. Dalton stood, raising his arms like a victor, basking in the laughter and cheers of his friends. Elena rose slowly, brushing dirt from her uniform. Her body ached, but her eyes burned with quiet fire. The circle of recruits began to break apart, chatter filling the air. Some shook their heads, already writing her off. Others glanced at her curiously, surprised she had managed even a single hit against Dalton. But Dalton wasn't done. As the recruits regrouped, he stepped toward her again, voice low but venomous. Next time, I won't let you get a single. Hit in. You'll see, Ramirez. You don't belong here. And I'll make sure everyone knows it. Elena met his glare calmly. Maybe, or maybe I'll prove you wrong. Dalton's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second. That night, the barracks buzzed with retellings of the match. Some recruits laughed at how easily Dalton had thrown her down. Others whispered about the elbow she'd landed, a rare moment when the giant faltered. Dalton's crew, of course, spun the story their way. She barely touched him, one said loudly. Dalton was just toying with her. The laughter spread, but Elena didn't react. She sat quietly on her bunk, polishing her rifle with steady hands. Her body throbbed with bruises, but her mind replayed the match over and over. The weight of Dalton's slam, the burn of humiliation, the single sharp moment when her elbow had landed. That moment mattered, because it proved something no one else had seen. She could strike him, and if she could strike him once, she could do it again. Harder, smarter, cleaner. It was only a matter of time. The instructors had noticed too. The next morning, during roll call, one of them, Staff Sergeant Mills, watched her carefully as the recruits stood at attention. His eyes lingered on her longer than the others. Later, as the recruits dispersed for drills, Mills called out, "Ramirez, a word." Elena froze, then stepped forward. "Yes, sir." Mills studied her silently for a long moment. His face gave nothing away, but his voice was quieter than usual when he spoke. "You've got grit, but grit alone won't carry you. Precision will." He paused, his gaze sharp. "Stop trying to match them blow for blow. You'll never win. That way, learn to fight your fight." "Yes, sir," Elena said, her chest tight. Mills nodded once, then turned away, his voice booming again as he barked at the rest of the unit. Elena returned to formation, her mind whirling. The words echoed in her chest like a spark catching fire. Fight your fight. That night, when the barracks fell into silence, Elena trained harder than ever. She moved through her drills with renewed focus, perfecting the timing of each strike, the flow of each movement. She imagined Dalton charging again, pictured herself deflecting, redirecting, striking at the exact moment his arrogance left him open. Her body ached, but she smiled faintly, because she knew the day was coming. The challenge wasn't over. It had only just begun. The sun beat down on the training ground, a merciless spotlight on the ring of recruits forming a circle in the dirt. The heat shimmered in the air, but it wasn't just the weather tightening chests and quickening breaths. It was the promise of spectacle. Word had spread like wildfire across camp. Dalton and his crew had challenged Elena Ramirez. The whispers carried electric energy. She's gonna get crushed. No way she walks out of this. 5 against 1? She'll break. And yet there was a quiet countercurrent in the murmurs, a sliver of curiosity. After her last bout with Dalton, after the one strike she'd managed to land, some wondered if there might be more to her. Still, curiosity wasn't faith. Most believed the outcome was already written. The instructors didn't interfere. They stood back, arms folded, eyes watchful. They'd seen fights break out before, seen recruits push boundaries, but something about Elena kept them silent. Elena stepped into the circle, her boots sinking slightly into the dust. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Around her, Dalton and his 4 friends fanned out, forming a half-moon of smirks and folded arms. Dalton's grin was wide, predatory. So here we are, featherweight. No more hiding behind drills. His crew chuckled, their laughter sharp and cutting. Elena didn't speak. Her stance set enough feet planted firmly, shoulders loose, eyes sharp. She wasn't here for banter. She was here for clarity. Begin. The instructor barked. The circle tightened, recruits pressing, closer to witness the clash. One of Dalton's men moved first. A heavy-set Marine named Kane stepped forward, fists raised. He charged recklessly, a wall of muscle barreling straight for Elena. Elena sidestepped, smooth and precise, letting his momentum carry him past. In the same breath, she pivoted and drove the edge of her palm into the back of his knee. Kane stumbled, crashing to the dirt face first. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Dalton's grin faltered. The second Marine came next, a wiry one called Price. He feinted left, then swung right. Elena ducked under the blow, twisted, and drove her elbow into his ribs with surgical precision. Air whooshed from his lungs as he crumpled to his knees. Clutching his side, 2 down. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, shifting from laughter to disbelief. Dalton's eyes narrowed. Don't just stand there. Take her down. The 3rd and 4th Marines moved together this time, trying to overwhelm her from both sides. Elena's focus sharpened, her training flowing through her veins. She ducked under one punch, grabbing the attacker's arm, and with a pivot of her hips, she flipped him clean over her shoulder. He hit the ground with a thud, the air knocked from his chest. A 4th swung wildly in desperation. Elena stepped. Inside his reach, striking his solar plexus with a precise blow that froze him mid-motion before he collapsed gasping. 4 down. The circle of recruits erupted into shouts, voices overlapping, some cheering, some stunned into disbelief. The energy shifted, the weight of inevitability lifting. And then only Dalton remained. He stepped forward slowly, his smirk gone, his expression a storm of anger and disbelief. His friends groaned in the dirt around him, defeated in seconds. Dalton's voice was low, dangerous. You think that makes you better than me? Elena's gaze didn't waver. It makes me prepared. He roared and charged, his massive frame thundering across the dirt. Elena didn't move until the last second, her body calm, her mind still. She sidestepped, just barely, letting his bulk graze past her. He swung again, wild with fury, but his movements were too big, too obvious. Elena deflected his arm, using his momentum against him, and struck a sharp, precise blow to his solar plexus. Dalton's eyes widened, his breath stolen. He staggered. But he wasn't down. He snarled and swung again, slower this time, desperation edging into his strikes. Elena ducked, pivoted, and swept his legs with a clean motion. The giant hit the ground hard, the earth shaking with the impact. The crowd roared. Dalton scrambled to rise, fury blazing in his eyes, but Elena stood above him, calm and steady. Her chest rose and fell with controlled breaths. She didn't need to finish him with more strikes. The fight was already over. Dalton knew it. The silence that followed was deafening. The recruits stared wide-eyed at the sight before them. Dalton, the strongest, loudest, most arrogant of them all flat on his back, bested by the one they had all called weak. The instructor stepped forward, his voice booming. Enough! Dalton froze, his fists clenched, but he didn't rise again. The instructor's gaze swept the circle and landed on Elena. For a heartbeat, his face was unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. The recruits whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with awe. She took down 5 of them. Did you see that throw? Dalton didn't stand a chance. Elena remained silent, her posture relaxed but steady. She hadn't shouted, hadn't gloated, hadn't needed to. Her strikes had spoken louder than any words. Dalton sat in the dirt, chest heaving, humiliation etched deep in his features. He met Elena's gaze, fury burning there, but underneath. Something else flickered. Respect. That night, the barracks buzzed with retellings. The story grew with each voice, some exaggerated, some downplayed, but the truth was undeniable. Elena Ramirez had done what no one thought possible. She had faced down Dalton and his crew, and she had won. Recruits who had once mocked her now looked at her differently. They didn't laugh when she passed. They didn't mutter when she stumbled. Some even nodded in quiet acknowledgement. And though Dalton still burned with pride, even he couldn't erase what had happened. For Elena, it wasn't about glory. It wasn't about revenge. It was about proof. Proof that weakness wasn't permanent, that doubt wasn't destiny. Her father's words echoed in her mind as she lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. The smallest crack can break the strongest stone if it's struck the right way. She smiled faintly. She had found her strike, and nothing would ever be the same. The training ground still smelled of sweat and dust long after the fight ended. Recruits had drifted away slowly, murmuring like a restless tide. Some left shaking their heads in disbelief. Others kept stealing glances at Elena, as if she had transformed before their very eyes. But when the circle finally broke and silence spread across camp, something intangible had shifted. For months, Elena Ramirez had been the weak one, the recruit destined to fail. Now, no one seemed sure what to call her. In the barracks that evening, the usual chorus of laughter and insults was absent. Boots scuffed quietly on the floor. Trays clattered in the mess hall, but even that seemed subdued. Every conversation carried an undertone of awe. She really dropped them all. 5, not 1, not 2, 5. Dalton looked like he'd seen a ghost. And though the words buzzed in every corner, they always quieted when Elena walked past. She didn't strut. She didn't smile. She didn't say anything at all. Her silence was heavier now, but it no longer read as weakness. It read as strength. Dalton was another matter. He sat on his bunk long after lights out, staring at the floor, fists clenching and unclenching. His friends, still nursing bruises, kept their distance. The humiliation sat on him like a lead weight, suffocating. He had built his identity on dominance, on being untouchable, and Elena had shattered it with precision and calm. But beneath the humiliation, something gnawed at him. Respect. He hated it. He fought it. But the image of Elena's calm eyes, as she stood above him breathing steady, not crowing in victory, would not leave him. For the first time, Dalton wasn't sure who he was in the presence of someone stronger. The instructors noticed too. Sergeant Mills, who had once barked doubts about her place in the program, now watched Elena differently. He still didn't smile. He was not the type, but his gaze lingered longer during drills. His corrections of her form grew sharper, more intentional, as if he was no longer questioning whether she could learn, but ensuring that she did. Instructors measured recruits not just by strength, but by resilience, by growth. And resilience was something Elena had in overflowing supply. For Elena, the silence after the fight was not emptiness, it was fullness. At night, lying in her bunk, she listened to the stillness in the barracks. No taunts came her way, no laughter. The air had changed, as she thought of her father. He had always spoken of silence as a tool. Noise distracts. Silence focuses. In silence, you hear the truth. Now she understood. The silence around her wasn't about fear. It was about acknowledgement. Even those who didn't like her couldn't deny what she had done. And that silence carried more weight than applause ever could. Training continued as brutally as ever. Runs through mud, endless push-ups under the sun, weapon drills that left arms quivering. But where before Elena felt invisible or worse, a target now eyes followed her for a different reason. Recruits began to ask her small questions in the margins of drills. How did you flip cane like that? What do you focus on when they're bigger than you? She never gave long answers. Just short, precise ones. Leverage, timing, breath. She didn't claim to be a teacher. She didn't claim to be better. She just shared the fragments she had learned through pain and persistence. And strangely, that was enough. Dalton didn't speak to her for days. When they crossed paths, his jaw tightened, his eyes burned, but he kept silent. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it wasn't mockery either. Then, one evening, during weapons drills, Dalton stepped beside her without a word. For a long while, they worked in silence. Blades clashing against padded dummies, wood cracking under strain. At one point, Elena faltered slightly, her arm trembling with fatigue. Dalton's voice, low and gruff, came unexpectedly. You need to shift your stance, lower. Elena glanced at him, cautious. His eyes didn't hold mockery, just truth. She nodded once, adjusted, and struck cleaner. It wasn't friendship, it wasn't apology, but it was something. The silence that followed her victory was not always comfortable. It was heavy, charged. Some recruits still doubted, still whispered in corners that maybe she had gotten lucky, that Dalton's crew had been careless. But no one dared laugh in her face anymore. Respect once earned is a seed. It doesn't grow overnight, but it had been planted. And in the silence, it began to take root. Late one night, Elena slipped out into the yard again. Old habits hadn't left her. She moved. Through her drills under the stars, body flowing with practiced precision. But this time, she wasn't alone for long. One by one, other recruits appeared, drawn by curiosity. Cooper, the quiet man who had once warned her she was pushing herself too hard, stood at the edge of the yard. Then Price, still bruised, but now more curious than bitter. Even Kane, rubbing the knee she had struck, watched silently. None joined her. They didn't speak, they just observed. And Elena, without breaking stride, understood. The silence that followed her was no longer isolation. It was gravity. When she finally stopped, drenched in sweat, Cooper spoke quietly from the shadows. Do you ever rest? Elena wiped her forehead, breathing steady. Rest is when you stop growing. He nodded thoughtfully. And the others, still silent, drifted back to the barracks. Elena stood alone again, But this time she didn't feel alone. Days turned into weeks. The story of her fight spread beyond her barracks, whispered into other companies, other drills. The words grew, reshaped, exaggerated, but the essence remained. She took down 5 Marines with a single strike, some said. No, she dismantled them one by one, like it was nothing, others countered. Dalton himself couldn't stand against her. Stories mutate in retelling, but silence doesn't. And every time Elena heard the whispers, she stayed quiet. She knew the truth. She knew the weight of every bruise, every late-night drill, every tear she had swallowed in silence. That was enough. One evening, Sergeant Mills gathered the company. His voice was as sharp as ever, his presence unyielding. Strength isn't measured by size, he barked. It's measured by control, by discipline, by the ability to endure, adapt, and overcome. If you need a reminder of that, look no further than Ramirez. The recruits shifted, eyes flicking to her. Elena felt the heat rise in her chest, but kept her gaze forward, jaw steady. It was the first time her name had been spoken in front of the company without ridicule, and it echoed louder than any cheer. That night, as the barracks quieted into sleep, Elena lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The silence was thick, but no longer suffocating. It was her silence now, a silence born not of weakness, but of strength, not of invisibility, but of recognition. She had not shouted to be seen. She had not demanded respect. She had simply worked, quietly, relentlessly, until silence itself spoke for her. And as she closed her eyes, Elena Ramirez understood something she never had before. Sometimes, the loudest victory is not in the strike itself. It's in the silence that follows. The weeks after the fight blurred into a rhythm of drills, sweat, and silence. But woven into that rhythm was something Elena had never felt before: recognition. It didn't come in applause, nor in the cheers of her fellow recruits. It came in the space she was given, the respect in the way people looked at her, the absence of mockery where once it had thrived. Elena Ramirez had not just survived boot camp. She was reshaping it. Graduation loomed closer. For most recruits, that day represented the end of a nightmare. For Elena, it represented proof that her nightmare had been worth it. The final tests were grueling. 20-mile hikes with packs that bent backs, combat simulations that left recruits coughing in the dirt, written exams designed to break the brain as surely as the drills broke the body. Elena approached each with the same steady calm she had carried since that fateful fight. Her body was leaner now, sharper. Every movement spoke of discipline earned through pain. But it wasn't just her body that had changed. Her presence had. Where once she slipped unnoticed through lines of recruits, now others shifted subtly when she entered. Not out of fear, though a little of that still lingered, but out of acknowledgement. And the whispers had spread far beyond her barracks. During one weapons drill, Elena overheard 2 recruits from another company murmuring, "That's her, the one who dropped Dalton's crew. No way, she's tiny. Watch her move. You'll see." It struck her then. The story had taken on a life of its own. In some retellings, she had struck all 5 Marines down at once with a single blow. In others, she had fought them blindfolded, barely breaking a sweat. Elena never corrected the rumors. Legends were never precise. What mattered wasn't the details, it was the weight they carried. And whether she liked it or not, she had become a legend. Dalton, for his part, carried his silence differently. Where once he led his group with cheers and dominance, now he was quieter, more measured. He trained harder, pushed himself further, as if determined to erase the stain of humiliation. Yet even as he worked, there was no escaping the truth. Elena had beaten him. On the night before graduation, Dalton found her in the yard, once again running through drills beneath the stars. For a long while, he said nothing. His shadow stretched across the dirt as he stood watching. Finally, his voice came low, rough, as gravel. "You're the strongest one here." Elena paused mid-strike, turning to face him. His eyes were steady, his pride tempered but not broken. She didn't gloat, she didn't smile. She simply inclined her head, acknowledging his words with the same silence she always carried. For Dalton, that was enough. Graduation day dawned. With the smell of pressed uniforms, the shine of boots, and the stiff posture of recruits ready to become Marines. Families lined the bleachers, waving flags and snapping photographs. Elena stood among her fellow recruits, the same uniform draped across her smaller frame. But now it fit differently, not because the fabric had changed, but because she had. She carried herself taller, shoulders squared, eyes sharp. When her name was called, the crowd clapped politely. But among the recruits, there was a ripple subtle nods, quiet recognition, the kind that mattered more than applause. She walked across the platform, received her emblem, and saluted. And though the ceremony continued, though dozens of names were called after hers, the silence around Elena remained louder than any cheer. But her story didn't end at graduation. It spread. Recruits whispered her name in other training camps, her fight retold with awe. She was called weak in training, they said, but she took down 5 Marines with a single strike. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others sought to verify it. But enough believed it that her name carried a strange weight, one that traveled faster than she did. Even instructors began to reference her without using her name. "Strength isn't just muscle," they barked at fresh recruits. "It's control. Ask around, you'll hear the story." And in every telling, her silence remained part of the legend. For Elena, the legacy wasn't about the fight. It wasn't even about respect. It was about proving that her father's words had been true, that cracks in the stone could break mountains if struck the right way. She had never wanted to humiliate Dalton. She had never wanted glory. What she wanted was to endure, to adapt, to rise. And in doing so, she had shown others that weakness wasn't permanent. It was only a stage, a perception, something that could be dismantled with time, precision, and will. That was her legacy. Months later, Elena found herself at a new assignment, far from the training grounds where her legend had been born. The air was different, the faces were new. But still, she heard whispers. "That's her, the one from boot camp. No kidding? Thought she'd be taller." And every time, Elena smiled quietly to herself, not to mock, not to revel, but because she understood. Legends weren't about height. They weren't about size. They were about presence, and presence wasn't something given. It was something earned. On a quiet evening, as she sat polishing her boots, a young recruit approached hesitantly. His shoulders slumped, his frame wiry and uncertain. "They say you weren't strong when you started," he said. His voice cracked with the same doubt she once carried. "Is that true?" Elena looked at him, studying the raw uncertainty in his eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "I was weak. I failed. I fell. I was laughed at." The recruit frowned. "So, how did you change?" Elena paused, then answered with the same steady truth she had lived. "I didn't. Not all at once. I kept moving, kept learning, kept silent. And one day, I realized the weakness wasn't me. It was what they believed about me." The recruit nodded slowly, his shoulders straightening just a little. And Elena understood. This was her true legacy, not the whispers of a fight long past, but the spark it lit in others who were told they were weak. Years would pass. The details of her story would bend, reshape, be retold in barracks across the country. Some would call it myth, Others would swear it was true. But every retelling carried the same core. She was called weak. She endured. She fought. And in silence, she prevailed. On the anniversary of her graduation, Elena returned to her old training yard. The dirt was the same. The barracks stood unchanged. But she was different. She stood in the center of the mat where she had once dismantled 5 Marines. The silence of memory filled the space. And she smiled. Not because she had proven them wrong, but because she had proven herself right. Her father's words echoed. Again in her heart, the smallest crack can break the strongest stone. She had been that crack, and her silence had split mountains. Epilogue. The legacy Elena Ramirez's name was never etched into history books, never broadcast on the news. But among Marines, her story lived on, whispered in bunks, retold around fires, passed down to recruits trembling under the weight of doubt. And in every telling, one lesson remained clear. Strength isn't always loud. It isn't always big. It isn't always what others expect. Sometimes strength is silent. Sometimes it's small. And sometimes it's the one they call weak who leaves the deepest mark of all. Elena's legacy was not in the fight itself, but in the silence that followed, and in the countless recruits who, remembering her story, chose not to quit.